Hi, it's Katrina. My friend David is actually going to be helping me out today, so we can give you a little bit more variety. Everyone say hi!
Number 10. The Legend of Gonzalo Guerrero. Spanish conquistador Gonzalo Guerrero left Spain in the year 1511 to go to the New World. He wound up in Panama, then was shipwrecked on his way to Santo Domingo. The crew survived, was set adrift, and wound up coming ashore on the Caribbean coast of Mexico, in what is now the state of Quintana Roo. When they were apprehended by the locals, just about every single crew member was either killed or enslaved. 8 years later, in 1519, Hernán Cortés began his famous conquest of Mexico. At that time, there were only 2 survivors from Guerrero's shipwreck. There was Geronimo de Aguilar, who became an interpreter between Cortés and the Maya, and Gonzalo Guerrero. Guerrero took a slightly different path than most of the Spaniards. After he served as a slave, he managed to gain the trust of Maya leader Nachan Khan. He built himself up to the title of captain of an army of Maya soldiers, married a Maya woman named Zazil Ha, and had 3 children with her. These 3 kids became some of the very first children born of the Spanish conquest. Within about a decade, Guerrero had almost fully integrated into Maya society. According to chronicler Bernal Diaz del Castillo, Cortés tried to persuade Guerrero to join his cause and fight against the Maya. But Guerrero, who had tattooed his face, pierced his ears, and had basically become Maya, changed sides. He ended up fighting great battles against his countrymen, labeled a traitor by Spain, and ultimately falling in battle. While his switch to the other side didn't change history, it most certainly could have if more Spaniards had thought more about the natives than about killing them and stealing their gold. Number 9. Hitler assassination. One of the biggest what-ifs these days involves Adolf Hitler and World War II. What if the plot to assassinate Hitler on July 20th, 1944 was a success? How could this have changed history, and how many lives could have been spared? The plot involved high-ranking German military officers and a bomb in a suitcase. It also involved something called Operation Valkyrie, which was to trigger upon Hitler's death. The assassination was attempted by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg. He belonged to a secret group of Germans who had enough of the war and wanted to change Germany's leadership before the whole country was in ruins. He agreed to put a bomb in a suitcase, attend a meeting at Hitler's headquarters, and blow everyone in the room up. Everything went wrong, just as the other half a dozen assassination attempts on Hitler had also gone wrong. The colonel stepped out of the room after he placed a bomb underneath the table where the Führer and the other top officials were holding their meeting. Somebody noticed the suitcase and moved it away from the people. When it exploded, it was nowhere near Hitler, and he wasn't even injured. Nevertheless, Stauffenberg heard the explosion go off and assumed Hitler was dead. Without even checking, he rushed back to Berlin and activated Operation Valkyrie. This involved arresting the Gestapo and the men of the SS and putting new men in charge of the military and the government. Just as the operation started, news came that Hitler was alive, and the colonel was found out. Many of the conspirators ate poison capsules and died before they could ever be apprehended, while an estimated 200 people involved in the conspiracy were hunted down and executed. Number 8. The Tutorberg Forest Disaster. The Roman disaster at Tutorberg Forest was one of their most humiliating defeats and a major turning point in history. It happened in the year 9 in the modern area of Kalkriese in Germany. An alliance of Germanic people, known to the Romans as barbarians, ambushed several Roman legions and auxiliaries in the dark woods and slaughtered them. It was a major incident because the Romans had been expanding their territory into the northern lands. Their massive defeat here brought the Roman period of expansion to a grinding halt. In the years following, Rome never pursued the area of Germania again, and the barbarian hordes accumulated strength until they eventually took down the Roman Empire. There are some historians who say the defeat didn't actually change history. They say even if the Romans had conquered Germania, they would have never been able to hold it. However, if the Romans had never been ambushed, history still could have turned out much differently. We don't know if they would have held the region because they were never given a chance. In reality, they could have seized Germania, then spread themselves into what is now Poland, up into Scandinavia, and even into Russia. Maybe the Roman Empire never would have collapsed, and they really would have conquered all of the known world. Number 7. Robert Peary and the North Pole. On April 6, 1909, an American adventurer and explorer by the name of Robert Peary did something incredible. He and his assistant, Matthew Henson, along with 4 helpful Inuit locals, came across what Robert thought was the North Pole. This made him the very first man in the world to reach the elusive top of the world, the very place where Santa supposedly has his workshop. It was a major achievement in history, and one that Robert enjoyed for the rest of his days. He was wrong. Many years after Robert was dead, errors in his travel logs surfaced and showed that he was actually several miles short of the North Pole. He thought he was the first one there, but he was actually only the first man a few miles from there. He almost changed history, but quite literally came up short. What you won't believe is that Robert Peary and Matthew Henson failed to reach the North Pole by a humiliating 30 miles, 48 kilometers. This was even more devastating, seeing as Matthew Henson would have not only been among the first men to reach the North Pole, but the first African American to reach the North Pole. It wouldn't be until 1952, on May 3rd, that Lieutenant Colonel Joseph O. Fletcher from Oklahoma stood on the exact location of the North Pole and actually changed history. Number 6. Abandoning Jamestown. The Jamestown colony was officially formed on May 14, 1607. About 100 people from a venture called the Virginia Company founded the settlement, which was the very first permanent English colony ever erected on North American land. It was an exciting time in history, and also a pretty gruesome one. The 100 settlers ran into issues immediately. Jamestown was almost a massive failure before the second wave of settlers showed up in 1610. They were stricken by famine, ravaged by unfamiliar diseases, and stuck in violent conflict with the Native American tribes who found them on their land. A shaky peace came following John Rolfe's marriage to Pocahontas, the daughter of a great Algonquin chief. The people of Jamestown began cultivating tobacco, expanded the area, and it remained the capital of the Virginia colony until 1699. It was the most important city to the English and was the very start of the United States of America. It was almost a total disaster. What a lot of people don't know is that back when the first settlers arrived, they almost gave up. Between 1607 and 1610, life was miserable for the settlers. They were weakened by starvation, they ate the leather of their shoes, consumed their own horses, and just about abandoned Jamestown altogether. Archaeologists even uncovered potential evidence of cannibalism. In the end, they held on until reinforcements came in 1610, and things started to slowly get better. Had they actually abandoned Jamestown, it's really hard to say just how different the history of North America may have turned out. Number 5. The Black Death. The Black Death was one of the biggest events in human history, and it almost altered the course of human civilization as we know it. The plague swept across Europe in the 14th century. Estimates vary, but historians generally agree about 50% of the population in many major cities was eradicated, and upwards of 1/3 of the entire European populace. The plague just about killed everyone in Europe, and even spread into Asia and North Africa. Against the odds, human beings survived. The horrifying plague Bacterium Yersinia pestis killed a lot, but not all. It was really more of a hiccup in history, not altering so much as hindering European humanity. What's interesting to think about is that if the plague had been even just a little bit deadlier and had actually managed to kill another third of the population, history would have been majorly altered. The African kingdoms would have probably migrated north, the Asian kingdoms would have migrated west, and Europe today would be a vastly different place. Number 4. The Blood Fluke. In 1949, a worm prevented what would have been a brutal and bloody invasion of Taiwan, thereby altering the course of history. Or to think of it in another way, the worm prevented the course of history from being changed at all. However you want to look at it, the Blood Fluke schistosoma japonicum played a major role at the end of the Chinese Civil War. The war had been ongoing for 2 decades. It paused briefly during World War II and then picked right back up. There were battles, truces, and violence from both sides. The conflict was fought between the Chinese nationalists led by the General Chiang Kai-shek and the communists led by Mao Zedong. The communists, near the end of the 2 decades of fighting, began to control most parts of China. It appeared the nationalists had no choice but to retreat, and so they ran to the island of Taiwan. In 1949, the communists were going to invade the island and put an end to the nationalists forever. This proved to be a really bad idea. There was nowhere for a whole army to even set foot on the island, and so the army started training their soldiers how to swim. They were going to drop the soldiers in the ocean and let them paddle to shore with all their equipment. Swimming lessons began in irrigation canals, which happened to be full of worms and parasites. They're called blood flukes, and about 10 million people were infected by them. The army got so sick that the invasion never happened, and Taiwan is still alive and well to this very day. Number 3. William Walker's Mutiny. Sergeant William Walker tried his best to change history and failed. In November of 1863, Walker organized a mutiny and protest in response to the Union Army paying soldiers of color only a sliver of what was paid to white soldiers. Walker was an officer in the 3rd South Carolina Volunteers, and he convinced his soldiers to put their guns down and not fight until they were given equal pay. They were only making about $7 a month to fight in the Civil War. The protest was short-lived, and Walker was convicted of mutiny on January 9, 1864. He was executed, and so were 19 other soldiers throughout the Civil War, who also led similar mutinies. These 20 mutineers may not have changed the tide of the war, but they almost came close. If more officers had been of a similar mind, thousands of more troops may have put their weapons down, and the South may have come out on top. Number 2. Failed assassination of Vladimir Lenin. On August 30th, 1918, Soviet leader Vladimir Lenin was shot twice after he spoke at a factory in Moscow. He was nearly assassinated by a member of the Social Revolutionary Party named Vanya Kaplan. Lenin was wounded but lived to terrorize Russia another day, and history was only slightly changed. In the aftermath of the assassination attempt, Lenin majorly cracked down on the Social Revolutionaries and any other political party that thought they could oppose him. Thousands of people were executed, and Russia was plunged deeper into civil war. But what may have happened if one of the worst dictators Russia ever saw was killed that day? It's really difficult to say, but history definitely would have taken a major turn. Lenin turned himself into the dictator of the very first Marxist state the world ever saw, and even though his government made peace with Germany, that peace didn't last very long. And besides, Lenin was the creator of the USSR, which stands for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. After he died in 1924, Joseph Stalin took his place. Joseph Stalin was the Russian version of Hitler, the creator of the Gulag, and the direct cause for the Great Famine that killed about 14.5 million people between 1932 and 1933. The reason Joseph Stalin is important to consider is because without Lenin, who, by the way, was responsible for an estimated 9 million deaths during his Marxist revolution, Joseph Stalin would never have come to power. It all could have been changed with a pair of bullets, if only they'd struck a few inches over. Number 1. The Failure of Napoleon. Russia was almost conquered by the French in 1812. It was almost a major turning point in history, and would have had major implications for everything that happened after, including probably stopping World War I and World War II before they ever began. Alas, the word almost is very important here, because on June 24, 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte crossed the Niemen River with the Grande Armée and made an epic fail. It was one of the biggest disasters the French ever saw. Napoleon had assumed the Russian army would fight his 500,000 troops. Instead, they teased the French and retreated deeper into the Russian winter. The French were not prepared for the cold, The roads were too poor to properly transport supplies, and about 300,000 French soldiers died. Yes, Russia lost about 200,000, 70,000 of those at the Battle of Borodino, but Napoleon was the big loser in this battle. The invasion went so poorly for Napoleon that after he sabotaged his entire army, he was banished to the Mediterranean island of Elba. What's your favorite alternate timeline of history? Let me know in the comments, and thanks for watching. Be sure to hit subscribe, and I'll see you again soon for another awesome video.